All right. Welcome to this week's live office hours. It's been a good week. I'll wait for everybody to start joining here, but hopefully everyone has seen some of the announcements we've been making. Two big betas in 1 week, which is insane, but really exciting. So it's been pretty heavy in a good way.
It's been a busy week, but busy is good. Lots of exciting things happening. A lot of good updates for both us and our users. Hopefully, giving them a few more things to work with, giving them a couple easier ways to do things. So yeah, a lot of good positive movement to kind of kick the week off here.
Exactly. I have been lost on my Twitter DMs, my email, just people banging down our doors asking for stuff, which is like cool because we're like, here it is, so we got a few people starting to join here. So the two big announcements, we have two massive betas happening right now. So both went live this week. First one is Walmart. So we officially got approved by Walmart. There's still some stuff we need to do on the marketing side with their team next week, but we're greenlit. We're good to go. So the beta is live now. So if anybody wants access to that doesn't already have access, reach out to support, request that. We'll get you added. It is still a beta, so there's still a lot of stuff that needs to be done there, but it is actively repricing, which is awesome. So that's a big deal. And it's like truly a native Walmart repricer. We're not just matching your price on Amazon. We're actually we built it solely for Walmart. And what's nice is our pricing is not changing. So it's still the exact same pricing that we have. You're not necessarily having to pay extra simply because it's Walmart. There's not a bunch of weird limitations that we see in the industry. It's connected. Do your thing. We're still looking at the average of the last 60 months revenue combined. But if that Walmart revenue doesn't push you to the next tier, you're not paying anything extra for it, which is very exciting. And then the second one is a API. So we've had this get requested here and there, not to the degree that we're like, all right, we really have to focus on this, but it started to kind of become more obvious to us that people want to build their own stuff. And talking with some larger sellers, they tend to have their own kind of conditional, algorithms and stuff like that. And they want to basically be able to switch strategies using their own data. So that is officially a public API. It's in beta, so you have to request access. But it's super cool. I'm already thinking, Casey, this, I'm a big fan of Raycast. I have wanted to manage an Aura account using Raycast solely. And with this API, I can now do that. And Raycast recently came out with, they call them AI extensions. So if you're unfamiliar, Raycast is like a launcher for applications on Mac. And I think they recently came out with Windows. But there's like a store where you can go and download these extensions, is what they call them, for all your different tools. So I have an extension for Things 3 for my task manager. I have one for Zoom. I have one for Linear, which is our project management. There's even ones for Safari. So I can just, search tabs. If I have a ton of tabs and I can't find what I'm looking for, I just search for it, hit enter, and it pulls it up. They came out with these AI extensions now where I can tag the application. So Messages is one I use. And I can just say, hey, do I have any unread messages right now? And it will go and do its own search, come back and be like, yeah, you got one. I can say, great, go ahead and respond with this to that person, hit enter, crafts the response, sends it for me. I'm already geeking out at the idea of building an AI extension for Raycast for Aura, where I could say, hey, go ahead and change the strategy for this SKU to Maven. And it goes, cool, I'll find that strategy, I'll find that listing, boom, boom, boom. I updated the listing, you're good. What? It's crazy. I'm getting excited, Casey.
Yeah, it definitely opens the door for a lot of kind of more ease of use functionalities. Obviously, not all of our users are comfortable managing API access or things like that on their own, but those that are comfortable or have that knowledge and wherewithal to kind of take advantage of that, it's definitely going to really open up the doors for, quick fixes, functionalities, almost bypassing things like uploads to change costs, mins and maxes, or anything like that.
Yeah.
So definitely a big improvement, especially for our larger users who may be managing a high number of listings and SKUs. That's definitely going to speed things up for those folks. And then, for any of those, quick key savants like yourself, it's going to let the creative juices flow for things like Raycast and other tools that you can kind of work in Aura via a different application with that API
Yeah.
access. So definitely a big improvement there. And we're definitely still looking for feedback on that API. Obviously, it being a beta, both the Walmart functionality and the API access. Give us feedback specifically
Yep.
on Walmart, as we know everything's not fully available just yet, but wanted to provide you folks with some kind of initial functionality to get things started. So currently it's like only buy box targeting is available. As we continue to develop that side of the platform, there will be more targeting options, repricing functionality, and things as well. So, but yeah, that being said, definitely let us know on that feedback. And lastly, I'm working on updating all of the docs and everything to include Walmart support language.
Yep.
So those will be updated in the near future as well. But as always, we're here to help. So definitely come chat in, ask any questions, see where we can jump in and help. We're always happy to give you a hand.
Yeah, we've kind of been teasing that we've been working on Walmart, at least in private groups. We haven't explicitly, publicly said that we were working on it, but I think it's important for our users and potential users to know what we're working on. Sometimes we can't give all the details because we don't have all the answers in the early days of when you start working on a new project, especially something this large. But we can officially say we've been greenlit. We've done multiple demos with the Walmart team, which was really fun. A little, nervous going into that final demo because it's like, 5 people on their team, and they're like, "Cool, show us what you built." And towards the end, we're like, "Cool, what'd you think?" They're like, "This is perfect. We're good." I was like, "Awesome." So their whole team was excited, which is awesome. So yeah, it's now we're adding tons of people to the beta, get that feedback. Like Casey was saying, there, it's not perfected yet. There's still so much we want to do with it. But we have those foundations. You can actually reprice totally fine with Walmart now. And it's really cool. So we're making a lot of, design changes because it's a really big deal as a software company to go multi-channel. Like just supporting one platform is one kind of architecture. Moving to supporting both is very different. There's a lot more complexities and things you need to kind of figure out. But the rebuild we did when we launched Aura 1.0 factored in a lot of those things in the early days. So we're able to move a lot faster with the development without having to go back and be like, all right, well, how are we going to make this work? It worked out of the box. So it's super exciting. We have a bunch of larger announcements related to Walmart, probably in a week or so. So, it's not fully public, but we have beta. You can get access to it today. Not a big deal there. And then, we're shoring everything up there. And then there's some bigger features we'll add for Walmart that I want to say what they are, but I can't. They're very exciting. It's really awesome. Like we're just finding there's more and more we can do with Walmart as we dive into it, as we look at the data, as we, kind of experiment. We're like, oh, wow, there's a lot more here than we anticipated going into this project. Because you hear a lot of times, developers on Walmart being like, yeah, there's just not a lot of data. And that is kind of true. But, we're hacky and we're nerds and we found workarounds for pretty much everything. So we can get some amazing data that nobody else seems to be able to figure out for some odd reason. And it's great. I mean, it's just, we're talking having true feature parity between Amazon and Walmart with some minor, differences like age of inventory. Amazon will give us age of inventory buckets via the API. Walmart doesn't do that, but there's a workaround there. It's just going to be slightly different how you do it. So there are those little things, but for the most part, we're able to get the same level of performance. I mean, it's bonkers.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see the sentiment around the functionality that we have initially, and as we continue to roll out more features and functions to folks, seeing how that compares to other options that are currently in the space, and hopefully we have a leg up on some of those other folks. We've heard kind of some initial feedback from some different users and different scenarios, different types of sellers, and think we have things positioned very well to continue to give you folks or not only an Amazon repricer that's top of the line, but also a Walmart repricer that provides the same, just about, if not all that same functionality. That's what we're aiming for. Obviously, APIs are like their own languages in a sense. So we're still learning to read that language and speak it fluently, kind of plug that into the platform effectively. So yeah, it'll definitely be a fun couple months as we kind of get our bearings in that landscape and continue to kind of iterate on what's possible and also what's best for users.
Yeah. It's been really fun to have people DM me like they usually do and be like, hey, heard about Walmart. Where are you guys at with that? I'm like, oh, I just gave you access. You have it now. And they're like, wait, seriously? Like, yeah, 100%. So it's really nice to be in this place with it live in the hands of users. And, you know, it's funny because it's really helping us, I think, shift our perception of Aura into less of just a software and more of a platform. There's a lot of amazing things we can do. And I've talked about this in a lot of like podcasts and lives with people where, you know, listen, and we've talked about it on office hours before. Selling on one platform, it has its own complexities and stuff like that. But the moment you go multi-channel, the complexities really exponentially increase. There's a lot more things that you need to be able to zoom out, see both platforms, see how things are going, because the way you make decisions cannot really be isolated. And I'll give you a good example. Let's say I can afford to order 100 units of a wholesale product. I'm selling on Amazon and Walmart, but I do have some capital constraints. I need to be able to look at the data and understand what percentage optimally should go to each platform. And that's really hard to do when you have data siloed out, right? Like if I'm just looking at my Walmart stuff and then I'm just looking at my Amazon stuff, I can still kind of get there, but it's going to be much slower for me to do that and a lot more manual work than having all that data in one kind of platform to be able to say, okay, well, you have far more data on this, on sales and things like that, the historical data. Let's go ahead and use something like AI or just basic statistics and understand really where should my balance be between these platforms on inventory. And so, you know, when you start thinking through that lens, you start thinking, okay, well, I'm probably going to need a platform that can see that way. It's really hard for us as humans to do that. So, yeah, it's cool. 2025 is insane already. I'm very excited.
Yeah, been a crazy Q1 as we, I guess, approach the end of that in a few days. But
yeah,
lots more exciting work and exciting evolutions of the product and the space as well. So always trying to keep up. But yeah, it's been a bit of crazy couple of weeks, and it'll continue to be crazy as we try to get things up to speed, fully on par with the goals that we have internally for the platform as a whole.
Exactly. Yeah. 2025 for the Aura team is going to be insanely cool. We have so many awesome things we're working on, want to work on that we just haven't gotten to yet. So it's going to be a pretty impactful year, which is very exciting. Shifting gears a little bit, OpenAI came out with a new image generation thing, and every seller on Twitter is using it. And it's so funny because it's blowing everybody's mind just how good it is. It's getting text correct. You can tweak little things here and there. I mean, it's actually very impressive. I've made mention probably a month or so ago that I think a lot of your product imagery will start coming from AI once it gets reliable enough where you can actually substitute your product into like lifestyle photos in a way that doesn't look photoshopped. It looks like as of today, we just hit that benchmark. Your cost of doing product imagery, especially if you're running your own brand and stuff like that, is very expensive. Like you have to hire, a model, you have to do, set design, you have to have a photographer, there's post editing, all that stuff. Now you can kind of just have a high res picture of your product and say, I want this kind of output. And it just does it. You can be like, oh, I don't really like this that much. Go ahead and tweak it this way. And then it's still consistent. I don't think it's going to be much longer until you start to see a lot of product images on Amazon come from these models. What's really interesting, though, is you can, in theory, take the requirements or the best practices for how to do product imagery that leads to higher conversion and just bake those into your prompts. And now you have high converting product images in a way that suits Amazon's requirements and leads to high conversion rates. So there's all these things that are starting to kind of crop up that are massive unlocks. Like if you're bootstrapping a PL product, you're probably not going to do amazing, in-person product shoots. Like it costs too much. Now you can do it in one afternoon and probably do it better, faster. I mean, just think about how much opportunity we're unlocking. I like to talk when we're talking about AI. I like to get people to understand you want to think about the latent potential in the average person, and how do we unlock more of that? So this is just one version of that, where that product or that company, that brand may have to wait 2 years before they can realistically do that, and now they can do it in an afternoon, get amazing results, scale faster, and they didn't have to build some crazy skill set or come out with a ton of money. That's unlocking potential. So not just the individual, but for brands, for companies, all these different things. It's really, really cool. One thing I'm testing right now, I have it on. It's called the Limitless Pendant. So it's listening right now. That's why it's got a little white dot. Think about this. What I did when I did wholesale, right? I would cold call a brand. It was sales. I dealt with objections. I had to get better and better at it. Well, what if you had something like this on and you're on speakerphone so I can hear both voices? And after each call, you can feed that over to a large language model and say, hey, here's what I'm, a nice little prompt. Here's what I'm trying to do. Like, I want feedback on what were the objections that were brought up? How did I handle each one? And for ones that I struggled with, give me recommendations on how I can tweak how I respond to that specific objection. And then imagine having 100-something calls worth of data that you can now feed into a large language model and say, hey, find the patterns, figure out what I do well, figure out what I don't do well with. You might find that if you open a certain type of way, you have a 20% increase in probability of getting the account. Okay, so always open that way now. We're, again, unlocking things, right? We've always done these kind of things without the data. It's just, this is how I felt. I feel like I didn't handle that well, but what if you did? What if you actually handled that perfectly, but it was your own insecurity that prompted you to feel like you should change that, but actually you shouldn't have changed that at all? I mean, this is where we're getting to. When I haven't talked about the, exponential seller concept in a hot minute, but this is part of that. Is like, it's using this new cutting edge technology in so many different facets to make you better. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I know we talked about users were starting to use AI, whether it's OpenAI specifically or AI in general, for item descriptions, focusing on the fact that a lot of folks, that you're trying to optimize for not only human search, but also AI search, because folks are starting to use AI search engines, whether it's, ChatGPT, Perplexity, things like that to search for specific products. And it's really interesting to see this development kind of now lean into the specific imagery as well. Obviously, optimizing imagery is very different in nature. There's not keywords or things to like hone in on. It's more so, for lack of a better term, just like the ambiance of the picture, I guess.
It's the vibe. It's all the vibe.
Yeah, exactly. Man. Yeah. So the fact that OpenAI kind of has a tool that seems to be doing this extremely well, and folks are already kind of taking advantage of it, is really going to help just optimize your store and your listings for the best conversion possible, which is obviously the name of the game. Especially as, you start to go on to different channels. Maybe there's an item description that's better on one marketplace than the other. Same with images, and you can kind of fine tune those things and track performance as it unfolds, and you tweak different areas as well.
Yeah, and let me show you. I just pulled up an example just to show everyone kind of what's possible right now. So these are the input, right? Literally, some dude holding a bubbly can. A very well consumed Red Hot Wings sauce. And here's what it turned out. Not that one, this one. I mean, that's pretty good. That's actually insanely good, considering the input was this guy just holding this in his kitchen. I mean, and he could tweak this however he wants. If he didn't like this slogan, he could go to ChatGPT and be like, hey, here's what I'm working on. I need a better slogan, factor in psychology, all these kind of different things, blah, blah, blah. Create me like a better four-word slogan, slap that back into here, and there's no Photoshop. It's just text, I mean, it's just, This is nuts. I don't know how long it took him to get this. I don't think very long from what I'm seeing on Twitter today. So again, if we extrapolate this out, do we get to a world where even resellers are running these kind of agents, whatever, in the background, and it's just analyzing all the data for every single listing and saying, okay, if I make these changes to the images, to the product title, to the backend keywords, whatever, we can probably get way more demand and rank better. And it just do that for you. Because now you don't necessarily have to have the human in the loop. It could just do it. And so, I brought up this concept probably a year ago of what happens when every time you jump on a listing, that listing self-optimizes, and that helps everyone. And it didn't really cost you anything. That's a very interesting world. And I would be very surprised if Amazon and eventually Walmart are not already considering this themselves. Like, it's very easy for them to say, hey, here's some recommendations. Like Walmart does this pretty well. You can go into a product and say, okay, here's our recommendations. Here's your score. This is interesting. The moment you have a way to measure how good you're doing, you can now build a model that says, okay, well, if we make these changes, what's the predicted change to the metric? Oh, this would take us up 40% on that metric. Do it. Right? Like some threshold where it's like, if it's greater than 10% positive increase probability, just make the change. So I think, you kind of have two paths here. Like the platform starts to do that themselves, which I think would make sense. But the inverse is just the sellers are doing that themselves. And again, a lot of things that are reserved so far for private label brands and stuff like that, I think will still be true, but it becomes more feasible for resellers to get the value of it because it's not costly and it's not time consuming. Those are the two big friction points why we don't do these things as resellers. But if you remove both those constraints, does it now make sense? And what does that mean for your bottom line? I mean, can we increase your average sales 10% per day? I don't know. And this is where a lot of the experimentation comes into play. It's like it's a lot of theory right now, but I'm very excited to start seeing a lot more of this kind of stuff being experimented on, being tested, and let's get some data on it. Let's see if it does work. Because listen, it's reselling, right? Some things that should work don't, and things that shouldn't work do. Very counterintuitive a lot of times, but it could be a massive, massive unlock for sellers.
Definitely, yeah, and I think that is kind of the really cool, but also a little scary is not the word. Maybe intimidating is a better word, where there isn't a lot of data around it, so we don't know exactly the impact it's going to make or what specific tweaks rather are going to make the biggest impact or maybe make a slightly negative impact. So now that the functionality is available, it is a good time to start really stress testing different, small moving pieces you may be changing, whether it's, strategies. I know we were talking about item descriptions and images and things like that, just starting to tweak those slightly in certain ways. I don't know if completely overhauling your entire inventory with AI generated images and descriptions is the place that I would start. I would maybe start with a handful of listings and see how that goes. But definitely exciting that we're just at the point where you can begin testing this stuff effectively. Right. It's not just pie in the sky. It'll be great when it gets here someday. It's here now. So starting to take advantage of that in the way that makes the biggest impact for you is always going to be best.
Exactly. See, Jacob, I'm excited to see the new Walmart beta. Yeah, Jacob, if you don't already have access to it, reach out to support, request access, and we'll make sure to get you in there. We are also very excited for it. So we got a lot more people jumping in. I know we've been riffing and kind of geeking out. Just, for formatting purposes, this is open office hours. There is no format. We're here to answer any questions you have, geek out with you guys. That could be any questions related to repricing, selling. We can dive deep into some Walmart stuff if you guys want to. But this is really just us here to support you guys, add some value, and hopefully kind of, help you solve some problems and shift your thinking. But outside of that, we're just going to keep geeking out until we have some great questions and comments come through. But if anybody would like access to the Walmart beta, please let us know. Reach out to support, request that. We'll make sure to get you guys sorted out. Let's see, Scott. When it comes to repricing FBM, should I use the target buy box rule to get more buy box? Casey, I'll let you jump in on that one.
Yeah, for that, Scott, in general, whether you are FBM or targeting FBM, or if you're an FBA seller, the buy box targeting strategy is going to be the best option for specifically targeting and winning that buy box. It's going to take the buy box winner as your primary competition and then follow your strategy settings. We typically recommend repricing around 2 cents below that seller to give yourself a better chance of kind of maximizing that margin, but also taking the buy box away from them. Obviously, there's no silver bullet for winning that buy box. So you may have to increase that margin on some listings. If that's the case, I recommend sometimes like a 5-cent margin seems to be a healthy area. But our Maven AI strategy is optimized for finding that balance between sales velocity and profitability. So attempting to win the buy box is part of its logic, but if it finds, for example, a seller is continually pricing below you, it's not going to continue to drop that price to win the buy box. It's just going to begin matching them. That's where that profitability comes into play there. But if your main goal is to win the buy box, you're definitely going to want to use that buy box targeting strategy. If you are looking to maximize margins, you want to start with Maven, and I'll actually pull up our Core 3 strategies article here. This is essentially the life cycle of your inventory that we recommend and the strategies to use. So we typically recommend starting with Maven for around 30 days, then going to the buy box targeting strategy at that 30-day mark to become a little bit more aggressive, and then finally liquidating that inventory to just increase that sales velocity. Make sure you don't run into any of those long-term storage fees. So I just posted that article there. That'll kind of walk through our methodology around repricing and the strategies to start with and use depending on both that inventory age, but also your specific listing goals as well.
Yeah. See, Scott, I've noticed Maven AI is great with FBA, but FBM not so much. Yeah, it really kind of depends. FBA is still king, so that makes sense to me. Maven can still handle FBM, but you got to keep in mind there are some limitations in terms of like how FBM performs. Period. Like if we go into Q4 and you're mainly doing FBM because you just can't get FBA stuff in, that's probably going to do very well. So there's a lot of seasonality when it comes to FBM, especially from Amazon themselves. So that makes sense to me. I would still start there, like Casey's saying. I would still start with Maven. I would probably keep it on for about a week or two and kind of just see how it's performing. If you feel like you're not getting enough velocity and you need to become a little bit more aggressive, that's when I would go to that second strategy, that buy box targeting strategy.
Yeah, and I think we know historically you have to maybe be a little bit more aggressive as an FBM offer to win that buy box or get that visibility. So that may be why Maven's not as effective on some of those FBM listings initially. But I have seen, Maven be really effective on FBM listings. So always listing to listing variation. It's always a case to case basis. But yeah, I typically recommend testing Maven for at least a week on listings. I say like 7 to 10 days should be plenty of time for it to kind of learn on that listing and then optimize itself. But if you're not finding that ideal performance at that point, that's when I would jump over to one of our rules-based strategies, definitely that buy box targeting there.
Exactly. I'm curious too, we're coming out of Q1 in a few days, going into Q2. How are you guys thinking about your strategy as a seller going into Q2? Are you already starting to think about Q4 if you're doing wholesale and, placing, back order POs and stuff like that? I'm really curious kind of like what's top of mind for you guys right now going into Q2? Or if nothing's changing, you're like, I'm just business as usual. Great.
Yeah, I'd be curious as well. I know Q1 is typically like the quarter of reviewing, Q4 performance from the previous year. January, There's a lot of returns and optimization. A lot of folks maybe not focusing on sourcing until you get into February or even March in this time of year. So yeah, I would be curious if you adjust your strategies at this time of year, if you become more aggressive, if you're just kind of getting back into the swing of things following Q1. If there's any, specific scenarios, processes you guys use, any thoughts around how to reprice effectively during this time and whether we can have a specific rules-based strategy for that or things of that nature. Would be curious to see what's, yeah, like what Dylan said, what's top of mind? What are you guys thinking about? And where can we jump in?
Yep. See, Scott, I've got a lot of FBM friendly items recently that look great. Just seeing the best way as I just recently signed up with Aura. Yeah, totally makes sense. It could definitely be a lot overwhelming when you first get set up, especially if you're doing FBA and merchant fulfilled. Merchant fulfilled can be, I think from my perspective, way more overwhelming because there's a lot more that you need to factor in and consider, just the way merchant fulfilled works against FBA with regards to the buy box and stuff like that. But once it clicks and once you have the right strategy, it's relatively straightforward. I would probably, like we've been talking about, start with Maven first few weeks and then kind of transition over to the buy box targeting strategy if you're finding that you're not getting enough sales velocity. But going to that buy box targeting strategy should set you up like really, really well. You may need to tweak how you're repricing against the buy box as an example. But if you ever get stuck and you're like, hey, I got the strategy, it's not really working the way I thought it would, I'm not getting the results I expected, reach out to support with a few of those SKUs. Let us take a look. We'll look at the strategy, we'll test it and say, okay, here's a few recommendations we'd make that should help kind of unlock that performance for you.
Dylan, out of curiosity, I know you were selling in a little bit of a different landscape, but was your approach as a seller any different around this time of year? Like, did you take a step back in Q1 like some folks do to kind of review, reassess before you start to reinvest in new inventory, or what was your general approach for this time of year?
Mine didn't really change that much because I was primarily wholesale. So I had a handful of accounts. They were consistent. The thing that I looked for was non-seasonality for the most part. Seasonality is great, but what I don't want to have is I can only sell this at certain points of the year. There's nothing wrong with that, but having small amounts of capital when you're getting started, you can keep some of that in your back pocket, but you can't take advantage of it as much. So I would focus on looking at the longevity throughout the year and say, okay, this is going to be pretty consistent. It's going to be boring, which is exactly what I liked. And it's just going to sell. And there's some stuff I can do to increase demand and stuff like that. So Q2 didn't really change. Q2 is when you kind of, especially if you're doing wholesale, you want to start talking with your suppliers to understand hey, what are you projecting for Q4 orders? What's the last day I could actually place a massive order? And I would start looking at, what do you anticipate ordering for each of those brands in Q4 and start to get your capital right? It doesn't mean you have to change anything. It's just you're strategizing, right? You're looking forward and saying, well, okay, well, if I think I can move this in Q4, this volume, how much is that going to cost me? I need to make sure I have enough capital to take advantage of that. And I need enough time to get my POs in early enough. So what you might do is you might place a back ordered PO so that they have it on file and it's not going to get executed until whatever day you guys agree on. But it allows them to say, cool, we can go ahead and go to manufacturing. We can order more, make sure we have that on deck. That way, once the time comes, you're kind of guaranteed that inventory. There's a sweet spot. You don't want to do that too early. I wouldn't really start to do it early Q2. I would start to really look probably late Q2. But now's when you want to start getting your data right. You want to start estimating a little bit more, kind of having your system and process down, and then starting the conversations with your brands of it. Hey, can we jump into a call? I want to talk to you Q4. Here's kind of what I'm anticipating. Is that going to put you guys out? What utilization of your inventory do you typically go through during Q4? Do you typically run out? Do you tend to have 10% left over? Get an idea for their constraints and their limitations. How long does it take them to go from manufacturing to it's available to ship to you? You want to understand lead times really well. A lot of sellers just think the lead time is when I, place the PO and it comes to me. That's not true. It's also going from manufacturing inside of that brand, that supplier, to their shelves, then to you. And so a lot of times that's going to be the longest if they're coming from overseas, right? So if they're doing, shipments overseas, like ocean, could be 30, 60 days. If they're doing air freight, it's going to be a little bit more expensive for them, but it's going to be faster. So again, you really want to understand, hey, what's your lag time from when you guys go to manufacturing to when it's in your warehouse during regular off season, and then Q3, because it's going to exponentially change. And you just want to make sure that they're aware of it too, especially if you're working with smaller brands. They're probably not thinking about this as well. They're probably not forecasting super well. And a lot of smaller brands are just going to run out of stock and think that's a win and be like, cool, we're good. We sold everything. No, because they could have moved an extra 20,000 units in Q4. They just didn't prepare for that, have the capital on hand to do it, whatever. You can also start looking at net 30, net 60, stuff like that, right? It's when you want to start getting strategic with your cash flow, deploying that into Q4. You need to have a good relationship to earn net terms for the most part. And net terms can bite you in the butt. So you do need to be very much aware of how you're doing it and understanding your risk. But if you're strategic with how you utilize that going into Q4 with backordered items, it's very nice, because you could say, hey, I'm going to backorder this to, into Q3. I'm going to be able to get it in before FBA basically shuts down. And I want, let's say net 30. So I'm going to buy myself 30 days before I need to start paying for it. You might need to do 20% down, something like that, to cover the manufacturing costs. But it allows you to spread your capital more effectively. There's obviously risk with it. It's kind of like options, right? Like it can go really well or really bad. If this is the first time you're experimenting with things with like net terms, I would probably start experimenting with net terms now when the risk is much lower, to get comfortable with the cadence. And then you can ramp those up going into Q4 if the brand allows it. Some brands may not allow that during Q4. They might want the capital up front. You can negotiate though. You can say, hey, listen, can we do 50% down when I place the PO, and then net 30 on the other 50%? You can do things like that too. That way you just have more cash available. So a lot of different ways to approach it. It really depends on how much capital you have. If you're super flush with capital, you probably don't need necessarily to float it as hard. If you're limited on capital, but you're selling things that consistently do well during the year and crush it during Q4, you probably have a good, probability of being able to pay that net 30 off relatively easy.
Right.
So yeah, there's a lot of financial planning that goes into really crushing Q4 at a high volume.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense, especially from the wholesale side of things. There's a little bit more cash involved in terms of volume at that point. So yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, wholesale is very fun, but once you get into like the crazy complexities of Q4, it gets kind of nuts. You don't have to go that route. You can just be like, hey, I'm going to buy what I can, and when I sell out, I'm done. Totally fine too. But again, it comes back to that conversation we recurringly have, which is like, what percentage of the opportunity are you trying to claim? Most sellers who are not trying to get strategic with it are probably claiming 40% of the opportunity, which means there's a lot of room for you to crush this Q4 if you strategize early enough and plan it out correctly, because there's a lot of moving parts. See, Scott, I have my minimum set at the average FBM buy box price / current buy box price. Should I stick with that or have my minimum a couple cents lower? Okay, so your mins realistically should not be that close to the buy box, especially when using Maven. Even rule-based strategies, that's a little too tight of a range, in my opinion. I would be looking at things like 15 to 30% minimum ROI, and kind of seeing where that's at. If that calculation is getting you that close to the buy box, that basically tells me that either you're not aggressive enough on your buy costs, so how you're purchasing your inventory, or two, you're on things that are massively increasing in the number of competitors relatively fast, which is going to necessarily drive down the buy box. So I would, if that is the case, I would reassess how you're sourcing, where you're sourcing, and how you're doing your analysis. If you're just manually setting that way, and that 15 to 30% minimum ROI gives you plenty of range, I would stick with that. Casey, anything you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I mean, I typically recommend having a min and max range that surrounds the buy box, that it's not necessarily super tight on it.
Yeah.
Obviously, effective min and max ranges varies heavily from one listing to another. Generally, I like to have like at least 10% below and above the current buy box price to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room on each side, so that if, like you said, if more sellers come on and that price starts to drop, you do still have a little bit of room within your set range to continue to remain competitive as that price continues to drop.
Yeah.
And then the inverse, right? If people start to sell out, you become one of the few, if not the only seller on the listing. That gives you the opportunity to still raise your price a little bit. But I kind of like that 10% below, 10% above buy box range, because in theory, every price within that set range would be a price that a customer would be willing to purchase that item at. You don't have a max that's super unrealistic. I mean, it'd be great to get 500% ROI at your max price, but what's the likelihood of someone actually clicking purchase at that point? So that's sometimes what I recommend. Obviously, like I said, depending on the specific listing, but I like that kind of 10% above and below. Gives you a good spot for a healthy sale anywhere within that range. And that should be a range that kind of promotes generally healthy sales velocity and keeps you competitive. Obviously, if you then have folks that are well below that, then you got to reassess, like you said, your buy cost. But that's a theory that I've kind of explained in a couple different scenarios. It seems to make sense for some listings.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point. Counterintuitively, you actually want a wide range within reason. There's law of diminishing returns, right? So you really don't want your mins and maxes to be that tight. I think starting at that 10, plus or minus 10% is like a really good starting place, because you want to think about like the natural ebbs and flows of a market. Like a price is not just constantly going to stay there unless there's only one seller or there's MAP. MAP will kind of force that floor. Outside of that, though, you're going to have ebbs and flows, and you want to be able to work within those ebbs and flows. A lot of sellers don't like that. You have to get comfortable with the ebbs and flows. And I think if you're looking at a 20% kind of range in total, that's a good ebb and flow range, in my opinion, for most things. Now, as the price goes up, that 20% is wider, right? And as your costs, or as the buy box price goes down, then that becomes a tighter range. So I think it's a good starting point. But if the buy box is, let's say, $20, that's going to be really tight versus the buy box is $70. It's going to be much wider. That's not a bad thing necessarily, though, because at a buy box of $20, is it realistic that somebody would be willing to pay 22, 23? Kinda. Would they be willing to pay 30? Probably not. Now let's take it up to $70. Would somebody be willing to pay $75 for that product? Probably. Why? Because the percentage delta is slightly different. Would they pay 80? Probably not. Would they pay 78 on the extreme? Probably. And so actually doing that percentage based on the buy box price, and I would look at the average, by the way, that helps you kind of flex that really well as the price is higher or lower. And that's a thing that we don't talk enough about. And I'm glad this got brought up in the conversation, because I think it's a really good framework for understanding how mins and maxes really work and how to think them through. So that's great.
Yeah. And that's why I kind of, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You're good.
No, I was just going to say, that's why I kind of use that 10% above or below the buy box as a general example, because as like you said, that item becomes more expensive. Naturally, the dollar range is going to be wider, but that still is generally competitive around that buy box price. Right. Like you said, someone will buy a $70 product, probably at 75, maybe 78, depending on what it is, how quickly they need it, things like that. Same thing with like a $20 item. You'll pay maybe 20, 22, 23 bucks, but 25 maybe feels a little bit pricey. So that general framework kind of helps establish a min and max range as you sell anything that could be purchased from $1,000 all the way down to 20. But you always want to kind of fine tune those things based on performance. You can always bump up or drop those thresholds by a few percentage points as well. But definitely a healthy place to start that isn't necessarily high risk, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
The bottom side of that range is still fairly conservative. And then the max side of that range shouldn't really take you out of the ball game. That's kind of how I look at it overall.
Yeah, that's perfect. Here's an example. One of my listings, 2050 is the minimum buy box price FBM, but I'm seeing FBM buy box at 2150 to 22. Okay, so if you're seeing it at basically 2150 to 22, I would basically take 10% off, that's your minimum. 10% added, so just times it by 1.1. That's your, that's a starting min max range is what I would look at. My anticipation is that your cost is probably much lower, so you can probably take that min lower than that 10% delta. Again, the first thing I would look at is I would look at what's the calculation for a 15 and a 30% minimum ROI. Where does that minimum price get you to relative to the buy box? If it's less than 10%, your buy costs are probably too high. If it gives you plenty of range, 20 to 30%, decrease from the buy box price, it's probably good. Yeah. There's a lot more to this conversation. What I would say is I would reach out with this SKU to support with your buy costs and stuff like that, and we can work with you to make it a little bit more specific to you. So, let's see. Angel, figure out what minimum ROI you're okay with, and let Maven do the max automatically. Exactly. Yeah. So if you're working with Maven, that's exactly what we do for rule-based strategies. We really don't recommend that you automatically set max prices. It's a little harder to do based on cost. That's just not really how the market works. But I do recommend to automatically set your minimums using your strategy in rule-based, and then I would manually set a max price. But again, starting with what Casey's saying, starting with that 10% and saying, okay, you're really looking at what's reasonable. And that's why we brought up that conversation before. Like, is it reasonable on this kind of product at this price point for somebody to pay X? Start with that 10%, see how that feels, right? And you kind of have a general idea, right? You kind of ask yourself like, okay, average buy box has been $70. Would I pay $80 for this? Well, if it's a niche hobby product, maybe actually. People's willingness to pay more does depend on the emotional aspect of it. There are things that I have a hobby in, I'm willing to pay a little bit more because I just want it. But if it's more utilitarian, I'm not going to do that, right? So you kind of play that game in your head, and you're not trying to get it perfect. You're just not going to be able to. You're just trying to make it reasonable. That's the big thing. Yeah, Scott, I don't want to accidentally tank the price. Totally get that. Your min price does not dictate if you're going to tank it. Your strategy does. So if you have a very aggressive strategy, and by aggressive, I mean, let's say you're going to reprice 2 pennies below the buy box. Anything more than that, I think I would consider aggressive. That could do that. It's not a guarantee because it depends on what the other sellers on the listing are doing. But if you're simply matching the buy box as an example, I would consider that not very aggressive. And you want to think about probabilities. What's the probability of my strategy forcing my price down? You want to think from that lens, and then you want to look at the competition on the listing, because if they're hyper aggressive and you become hyper aggressive, I can kind of say with an 80% certainty where the price is going to go. If they're not hyper aggressive, then the probability goes much lower. But if you ever have any questions, if you're like, I don't know if my strategy is going to take my price, reach out to support, ask us, send us the name of the strategy. We'll take a look and tell you exactly how it's going to play out. We can get you pretty close.
Yeah, that's the nice thing with Maven. It's recognizing when that price is dropping quickly and it decides to match instead of continuing to price below. So that kind of ends a price war on certain listings.
Yep.
And like you said, I mean, buy box targeting won't tank your price unless the buy box continues to rotate to someone below you, in which case it will incrementally drop. But yeah, always recommend setting that min price at a spot that's still acceptable for a sale, so that should you be priced at your min price, you're not selling at a $5-10 loss. You're selling at a spot where, though it may not be ideal, still an acceptable threshold for that sale.
Yeah. That's I'm glad you brought that up. You really want your mins to be acceptable to you. I think 15 to 30% minimum ROI is what I tend to see pretty consistently. Personally, I'd be happy with 15% on like the low end. I think 30% consistently, and above, happy with that. But everybody's kind of different, right? So it depends on how you buy, what you buy, all those different things. See, Scott, my buy costs are pretty low. I just want a baseline to see what would keep my prices good but competitive. Yeah, makes sense. With your buy cost being so much lower, I would aim for like a 30% minimum ROI to start with and let that ride. So we got about 11-ish minutes here left. So any last minute questions, anything we could dive deeper into with you guys, we're more than happy to do that. A lot of people jumping in later. So I'm going to recover the two big announcements. So we have two big betas live right now. First one is Walmart. So if you want access to that, just reach out to support, request access. We'll get you added to the Walmart beta. It is a beta, so it's not fully fleshed out, but it is actively repricing listings right now and doing incredibly well. There's going to be some gaps in data that you're not going to be able to see quite yet, but we'll get those added shortly. And then the second one is our API. So we have launched a beta public API, meaning if you're a developer, you can actually jump in and manipulate your Aura account with your own code, which is pretty exciting. So that's live now, still feature flagged. So if you do want access to either of those, just reach out to support, say, hey, I want, access to Walmart, or I want access to the API. We'll flip those flags for you guys and you'll immediately have access to it. See Angel here. Also figure out if you actually make more at your max if you go manual. Sometimes you actually make less because of FBA fees. Example, a product I sell, I make less if I sell at 1001 versus 999. So I max out at 999 for certain products. Yeah, that's a great thing. So Maven handles a lot of those kind of fee discrepancies at different price points automatically. Rules-based doesn't really do that as well. It's just very different. We do factor that in for mins and maxes. Casey, correct me if I'm wrong here. But yeah, with Merchant Fulfill, there's a lot more kind of manual testing to kind of figure out exactly what works and what doesn't from a pricing perspective, or from a profit maximization perspective is what I'll say.
Yeah, and those reduced profit ranges are taken into account. Specifically, Maven will avoid a range if it recognizes that you'll make less due to those fees. With that being said, those fee structures are ever changing and always
Yes.
not necessarily hyper accurate from what is provided from Amazon. There's been instances where we've even checked fee structures and Amazon's own fee calculator is not properly calculating those same fees. So a little bit of a, I'm not going to say guessing game because it's a little bit more precise than fully guessing, but estimations we'll call them. But yeah, Maven will avoid those reduced profit ranges for you. And I believe some of the buy box strategies might as well. I'm not, no, we'll say Maven avoids those fully. And then I would, and the mins and maxes will also factor those in.
Yeah.
But the buy box strategy or rules-based strategies will strictly follow your specific settings. So if that determines that you may be in one of those ranges, you might want to adjust those mins and maxes if you are setting them automatically. Should be all set, but can always jump in and override those manually there.
Yeah, and we're looking at similar things for Walmart. They have their incentive program. There's some odd things in terms of how that works. So, if I'm not mistaken, it's 25% above the competitive price. It will take you out of it, which is nice. But if you're pricing within that, you can technically update your price to anything within that range, but your live price won't change, which is kind of confusing because it says, yeah, updated, but it looks like it didn't change. And it technically did, but they're basically capping you at a certain value. And what's difficult is, if 5 of us are on a listing on Walmart and we're all in this program, we could be anywhere from $20 to $25, but we're all at $20. And then Walmart's going to give us the delta as an incentive, but you don't know where anybody else is at. So it's kind of this game theory problem where it's like, we're all blind, but we can go ahead and assume that Walmart's going to want to prioritize the people who they will have to shell out the least amount of dollars for, which makes sense, but you don't know. And so we're looking at those kind of odd things too. So it's interesting how similar Walmart is to Amazon in terms of doing certain things, but they're slightly different in how they're being done. So, you have like reduced profit ranges with Amazon. You have this incentive program with Walmart. There's a bunch of stuff you got to factor in there, like these dead zones is what I'm going to call them. We call them reduced profit ranges with Amazon, but just more generally, I'm just going to call it a dead zone where it's not really a great place to be at unless you know exactly what you're doing, and you can't really see what your competition's doing. You're just blind to it all. So very interesting stuff.
Yeah, the incentive program on Walmart will definitely be one of the more complicated and interesting functions to think about in that marketplace. Like you said, you could have 5 people that are shown being listed at $20, but behind
Right.
the curtain, someone could be $24, someone could be 22. So the
Totally.
$24 offer is going to be prioritized because Walmart has to then shell out less for the incentive program. So yeah, definitely a lot of moving pieces there. We'll try to come up with some sort of documentation or some
Yeah.
sort of explanation for those scenarios to try and paint a clear picture for folks as they start to get more involved on that side of things. But
Yeah.
yeah, a little bit of smoke and mirrors from Walmart on that side in terms of what may be actually going on behind the scenes as opposed to what's being shown on that specific listing page as well.
Yeah, and even the competitive price. This is very interesting. You have your pro seller badge. You have to maintain that. What's funny is that if you're out of stock, your price, your listed price, is still factored in to your pro seller badge metrics. So one thing a lot of sellers are doing is when they go out of stock, they're matching the competitive price, even if they're never going to restock it, which is like a big manual process, right? So we're looking at like, okay, well, how does that make sense? Because you tend to want to be at a higher price coming into the buy box. So there's like 2 categories. There is I am out of stock with nothing inbound, and then there is I am out of stock with something inbound. Short term, I want my price higher, but the moment I'm in this first camp, go to the competitive price and keep my pro seller badge super healthy, my metrics, all that stuff. So there's a lot of those like kind of nitty gritty things, those subtle nuances that are very unique to Amazon or to Walmart that we're looking at and, kind of playing around with and saying, well, how do we factor this in so the end user just doesn't have to deal with it? We just do it for you, and then you're just good to go. So
yeah, always trying to make it so your platform works for you and not the other way
yes.
around. That's always the end goal.
Exactly. You should not even have to know that it's happening and still get the benefits from it. That's the exciting part. Awesome. So we're going to wrap up here for time, unless there's any last minute questions. Again, this is live office hours. We do this every Wednesday from 2 to 3 p.m. EST. There's no format we get on here. We geek out with you guys. We share some news and things that we're seeing, but we're really just here to provide value, answer any questions you have. But if you have questions between these sessions, please reach out to support. Again, we do have the Walmart beta live. So if you want access, just reach out to support, ask for it. We'll get you live. If you want access to the API, the public API, reach out to support. We'll get you added there. And if you have not done your onboarding session, please schedule one. It is the best thing you can do when you start with a repricing software like us, is get in there, ask some deep questions that are really specific to you, things we can't really do in this conversation. We can do in that one-on-one session where we can look at your actual products, look at the ASINs, look at the data, and say, here's exactly what we would recommend to do. So it's really personalized to you, your goals, what you're attempting to do, and we make sure that you're set up for success there. With that, I think we'll end it. Yeah, Casey?
Yeah, that's all we got. Have a good rest of the week, and we'll see you next week, same time, folks.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.